Chapter 9 of Doomsday Eve by Robert Moore Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doomsday Eve, Chapter 9. Coming back to conscious awareness, Kurt Zen simultaneously realized that something which he had been experiencing, and which had been very important, faded out of his memory like a gray ghost sliding silently away into a pearl-colored mist. Nedra was shaking him by the shoulder and was smiling down at him. "Wake up, sleepyhead. You've been snoozing for 18 hours. That ought to be enough even for a growing boy like you." Her face was radiant and alive. She looked as if she had just stepped out of a cold shower and had rubbed her beautiful body with a rough towel to bring the blood close to the surface of the skin. "You look wonderful," Zen muttered, remembering what John had hinted. "Did you have a good night's sleep?" "A couple of hours." "No more than that?" "I needed no more." Zen said. He started to add another word, alone, but managed to catch the question before it was out of his mouth. He examined her thoughtfully. "You look very contented," he said, without adding that in his experience, women who looked so contented had only one reason for it. "Why shouldn't I look contented? After spending so much time in the wilderness, I'm back on the stairway to heaven." "What's the wilderness?" "The world down below." She swept her hand in a gesture that included the unseen ranges and the plains below. "Ah, yes." He yawned himself to wakefulness. "I was reading the most fascinating book before I dropped off to sleep. Here, I'll show you." The book was not on his blanket. It was not in the wall niche, nor was it behind the bed. "Hey, it's gone," he said. His eyes went around the room. He discovered other things that were missing. "The lieutenant's gun, and my pack." "Perhaps you just dreamed you had been reading a book." "I didn't dream the gun and the pack. I carry both of them in here." "I can explain about them. They were taken." "Huh? Why?" "Weapons are not permitted here. Your gun and your pack were both taken for this reason." "Huh?" A growl came unbidden into his voice. He put these items out of his mind with the resolve to speak to someone about them at a later time. Something more important had happened. What was it? A memory of his dream flicked through his mind, but was gone before he could grasp it. A frown on his face, he said, "I know." As he tried to speak, what he had intended to say slid out of his mind. "You know what?" Nedra asked. "Everything." Her face showed surprise. "This is a great deal for one man to know. Are you sure?" "Yes." "Positive?" "Hell yes." An emotion that was like a curtain opening and closing slipped across her face. "Well, in that case, tell me things." "I would, except I can't remember 'em." Doubt came into the violet eyes. "What you need is some breakfast. Your blood sugar levels are too low. Breakfast will take care of that." Her voice was firm and sure. "That's one thing I need," Zen said, his voice equally firm. "But there is one thing I don't need. An examination by a head shrinker." "A what?" "A psycho," he explained. "I call them head shrinkers because that is what they do." "Oh, maybe I need such an examination, but I have no intention of submitting to it." Breakfast consisted of cornmeal mush, fried to a golden brown, and served with butter and honey. There was no coffee, but he had long since learned to do without it. He ate ravenously. "I'm hungry right down to the marrow of my bones," he said. "Where does all this grub come from?" "We get it," Nedra answered evasively. "What do? Raid the low country for supplies, like Cusow's men?" "No, Colonel, hardly that. We are not thieves." Her face showed displeasure. "Well, where do you get it? I don't know how many of you are here, but if you have as many as 100, keeping this place supplied calls for some doing." He was fishing for information on the number of people hidden in this old mine. "Actually, very little food is needed." How come? Don't they eat? Are you reading my mind? The girl demanded. If so, you might as well learn right now that this is not considered good manners here. Momentarily, she was angry. And besides, if you do it again, I'll close off my thoughts to you. Zen, with a forkful of mush halfway to his mouth, was so surprised that he tried to speak and to swallow the mush at the same time, with the result that he choked. The inference back of her words opened up wide horizons of speculative thought. Was mind reading actually commonplace here? I'm sorry you choked, Nedra said. She pounded him on the back. Why don't you put me over your shoulder and burp me? Zen complained. Lay off with that pounding. Do you feel you really need burping? Aw, shut up, Zen answered. If she thought he had read her mind, did this mean that she was actually capable of reading his thoughts? Could all of these people read his mind? Had the nude bronze girl going through the rhythmic exercises known what he was thinking about her? Zen felt himself coloring. It was one thing to have the normal libidinous impulses of the male, but it was quite another thing to have every woman know what he was thinking about her. Colonel, I do believe you are blushing, Nedra said, a twinkle in her eyes. I am not, Zen said. Actually, I was wondering whether or not I could read your mind. I told you it was not good manners here. Good manners or not, you seem to know what I was thinking. It isn't necessary to read your mind to know what you are thinking if a pretty woman is concerned, Nedra said primly. Your thoughts are written on your face. Ah. For a moment, his confusion grew. Her understanding was much too acute. Was she playing games, making fun? If so, this was a game that two could play. In that case, since you already know about me, how about it? He said, looking boldly at her. She understood his meaning. For a moment, the violet eyes showed sadness. They seemed to indicate that she was disappointed in him, that she had hoped for much better from him. Then a sparkle came into them. I told you once before. Yeah, I know. You are going to wash out my mind with soap. But let's not do it right now. I'm still hungry. You are one of the most perplexing men I have ever met, Nedra said as she rose to fill his plate again. Also, one of the fastest. I thought you were going to stay away from that subject, he protested. I intended to say fastest on his mental feet, she answered. And if you don't stop interrupting me to make a play on words, I'm going to give you a hit on the head. After that, Sam wants to see you. Sam, huh? He said, with no real enthusiasm in his voice. Somehow, this morning, he did not relish seeing the craggy man, but there was the matter of the missing pack and gun to be taken up with someone in authority. He suspected that West was that person. The craggy man was alone in the room to which Nedra took him when he had finished breakfast. West was standing with his back to them as they entered, staring out of a picture window that was set flush with the wall of the building. Turning, he nodded to them, then motioned to them to come and stand beside him. Kurt Zen looked out on one of the most breathtakingly beautiful scenes he had ever seen. Directly below them, the cliff dropped away for hundreds of feet, a blank wall of sheer rock. To the left, climbing up into the sky, was the peak of the mountain, solid granite. They were just at the edge of timberline here. Lower, the trees began, spruce, fir, and aspen, marching downward tier on tier over a series of rolling hills that concealed more than they revealed. In the distance was the Front Range, a towering sweep of mountains that looked small, but which Zen knew to be rugged country. He had climbed them too recently to have any doubts as to how high they were, and how rugged. In the far distance, cumulus clouds were visible, thunderstorms beyond the mountains. Thy purple mountains' majesty above the fruited plain. The words of the song came unbidden into Kurt's mind. Down below him was America, or what was left of it. A pang came up in his throat at the thought, and he felt muscles pull and knot in his stomach. He had loved this land. America had stood for freedom. Her sons had fought for it, on battlefields in every corner of the earth, from sun-baked equatorial Africa to the freezing bitter steppes of Central Asia. While her sons had found graves fighting for freedom, something had happened to the freedom for which they fought. Nobody knew quite what had happened, but it had gone away. Possibly it had been lost as emergency followed emergency on the international scene. Possibly it had been strangled in red tape as regulation followed regulation on the national scene. The time had come in America too, as it had come to foreign lands when all actions that were not compulsory were forbidden. Thus freedom had died. "Do you feel as bad as all that, Colonel?" West said softly. The man's face was grave, and each ridge on it seemed carved out of another and harder kind of granite. "It seems such a shame," Zen said. "I loved this land. It was my country. And I don't feel that I have to apologize for a gulp in my tongue as I talk about it." "It is not necessary to apologize for loving one's own land, Colonel," West said, his voice softer still. "You are not alone." "Not alone?" Zen said. "From you, this talk sounds strange." "We have all loved this land too, Colonel, and the principles for which it stood. That is why we are here." West's voice became softer still, but the gravity in his face seemed to increase. "That is good talk," Zen said. "However, if I have learned one thing, it is that talk is cheap. You are outlaws hiding here, yet you talk of loving the land that you have failed to serve." He felt his voice grate as he spoke. "Bravely spoken, Colonel," West applauded. A glint that might have been appreciation and might have been the edge of hidden anger showed in his eyes. "Particularly so, since you are in the power of these, outlaws." "Very brave," Nedra agreed, "and very foolish." "You did not bring me here to tell me that I'm in your power," Zen answered, "nor to comment on my bravery, nor my foolishness." "I think he can read minds," Nedra said. "I do not in the least doubt it," West answered. "If he did not possess this ability, or almost possess it, he would not be here." "I, in my turn, think both of you are nuts," Zen answered. "I'm not putting on a mind-reading act." "Not consciously, Colonel, of course," West agreed. "You think your thoughts are your own. Often they are. But there are also times when they have originated with somebody else. However, before you tell me that I did not call you up here to discuss your mind-reading ability, or lack of it, I will show you one reason why I wanted you. Take the glasses. Observe the ridge in the far distance, just under the pines. Tell me what you see there." "Horses," Zen said. "No, mules, with riders. Kuso's men are going out on a raiding party looking for food, ammo, and women, if they can catch 'em." "Right, Colonel. Except that they probably have the additional duty of inspecting the damage their blooper did when it exploded." "I hope they inspect that damage from close range," Zen said fervidly. "That area is hot. If they will only spend an hour or so—" He broke off as he remembered that both Nedra and West had spent too much time in the same hot zone. "They will not be that foolish," West said. "I know some people who were," Zen said. "Perhaps the area, at least on the fringes, was not as hot as you had thought," West suggested. "My counter said it was," Zen answered. "Possibly your counter was in error. Now, if you will come into this room, Colonel." West moved through an archway in the stone wall and into another room, holding the heavy draperies aside so Zen and Nedra could enter. An opaque screen was set into the wall. Several chairs, including one large seat with control buttons built into the arms, were in this room. West closed the curtain over the arch through which they had entered and motioned Zen to a chair. The craggy man slid into the chair with the buttons on the arms. Nedra sat beside Zen. Relaxed and at ease in the chair, she seemed to have forgotten that such creatures as kernels of intelligence existed. West pushed a button. Light flicked across the screen, danced an erratic pattern there, and vanished. An image began to form. Firming, it increased in detail and became a city. Or what had once been a city. The place was blackened now, the buildings lying in ruins. Towers had toppled, windows had broken, the ravages of fire were visible. Here and there, tall buildings had crumbled into streets that crossed and crisscrossed each other at crazy angles. The rubble from the broken buildings still lay where it had fallen. "Washington, by thunder," Zen said. "This was their prime target. We stopped their bombers cold, but they eventually got through with a guided missile. The city is still hot. You can see it right there on the screen. Not a sign of life." He became excited as he relived those first mad moments when the Asian Federation had struck out of nowhere. In this moment, what little freedom that had remained in America had been given up in the face of the seemingly more important necessity of remaining alive. "Yes," West said. "Now what do you see?" The ruined Washington faded from the scene. As it faded, the broken dome of the Capitol building, its top had been blown off in the blast, was revealed looking like a mysterious crater on the moon open to the sea of space. Another city came on the screen, a mass of broken buildings where two rivers met. "I think that's Pittsburgh," Zen said. "They were eager to hit us there, to cut down on our industrial production potential. They got Gary, Indiana, and South Chicago for the same reason. In spite of everything we could do to stop it, they eventually got through to our major production centers. If we hadn't foreseen the possibility of this happening, and had not spread our industry across the country, breaking it up into small parts, they would have crippled us so badly before the war even started that we would not have lasted long. However, even with our production spread, when they hit the sources of our raw materials, they hurt us bad. Our stockpiles gave out after a couple of years. Since then, we've been scavenging for metal wherever we can find it." "Yes, I know," West said. "Of course, while they were hurting us, we weren't exactly helping them," Zen said. "We had a few guided missiles ready in their launching racks ourselves. We weren't exactly defenseless." Pride came into his voice as he spoke. "I agree with you there," West said. "Would you like to see some of our results?" "Hell yes," Zen blurted out, surprised. "Our photoships have never gotten really good pics. Have to fly too high for that. Oh, we have turned loose a flood of pics that purported to show how we had bombed hell out of the enemy, but these were all retouched to boost public morale. But how does this radar work?" "Do you mean to tell me you can actually see what is going on inside the country of the enemy?" Puzzled wonder crept into his voice. Behind the feeling was a keen interest. If he could use this radar to see into the country of the enemy, it was a very important invention. Though West did not seem to realize this. In war, information was always as important as weapons, and sometimes more so. Knowledge of the enemy's troop dispositions, of his strength and his weaknesses, was often more than half the battle. West did not answer. Another city swam into position on the screen. Zen caught a glimpse of a single minaret standing among the bare ruins and hazarded a guess as to the identity of the city. "Moscow?" "Yes." "Good. One of our fast planes sneaked over in full daylight, dumping his load. When the photo plane passed over hours later, the city was still burning. We really blasted the hell out of that dump." "You sound pleased, Colonel. Do you know how many millions of people died directly or indirectly in that bomb explosion?" "How many millions died in Washington, Pittsburgh, and Chicago?" Zen flared. "Granted," West answered. "But after the first man was killed, does it help the situation to kill a second? Or does killing the second one merely make it more likely that a third one will have to be destroyed? What the hell difference does it make? This is war." "That is also granted. However, the rules of life do not change because men declare war." "Don't be so damned academic that you forget to be realistic. They were striking at our heart," Zen said, bitterness deep in his voice. Look, we didn't seek this war. We did everything we could to prevent it. We tried compromise, arbitration, placation, and everything else we could think of. Nothing worked. They struck in the dark without warning. As he spoke, his bitterness turned into deep anger. "That is also granted," West said, while the ruined city was displayed on the screen. "But does it make a great deal of difference?" Zen stared at the man, wondering what kind of a human he was. In the dim room, it was difficult to make out West's features. "It makes all the difference in the world. We believe in fairness. They ignored it. We believed in a better world. They would plunge us back into the night of barbarism. We believed in freedom. They wanted slaves. They set up a slave state and threw armed slaves against free men. We had no choice except to fight back." "I see nothing to argue in all you have said," West answered. "Nor is it to my purpose to attempt to justify the actions of the Western democracies. They need no justification. Nor do the actions of the Asian Federation need justification. In their eyes, they were right." His voice was a low monotone of sound without the trace of an emotion in it. "Then what is your purpose?" Zen demanded. "First, to point out that the human race is one organism. Viewed in its totality, it is just that, an organism. All the billions of individuals who compose it are cells in that organism." "I am familiar with that theory," Zen answered. "A few crackpots have always insisted that we are a biological entity, but they have not succeeded in proving this." "Haven't they?" West said. The slightest touch of irony appeared in his voice. "Not as far as I know." "Is it possible, Colonel, that you do not know everything?" West asked. "It is not only possible, it is obvious," Zen answered, unruffled by the cutting question. "If I knew everything, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I would be out there winning a war." "The point I want to make, Colonel, is that the human race is divided against itself. Historically, this has been going on since remote ages. War after war after war. I do not see how America is responsible for the errors of history," Zen said. "We tried to avoid them. God knows we tried." Emphasis crept into his voice. "I did not say these were errors, Colonel," West replied. "I merely said they were history." "But what point are you making, if not the one that wars are mistakes?" Zen asked, surprised at the way the other's thinking had gone. "I am making the point that war seems to be the way the entity, the human race as a whole, evolves. The method of evolution revealed by history is the pitting of one part of the entity against another part, then letting them fight it out to see which one is the more efficient." A touch of grimness sounded in the voice of the craggy man. In the dimly lighted room, his face was as bleak and as lonely as the granite outcropping at the top of a mountain. "This is a very savage philosophy," Kurt Zen commented. "If I may disagree with you again, Colonel, I do not think that this philosophy is necessarily savage. True, a great many men die in fiendishly ingenious ways. A great many women and children suffer. True, this system produces hunger in the world, and a fear so deep and so intense that the heart is hurt even to contemplate it." "How can this be anything but savage?" Zen protested. "I don't care whether our side or the other side is doing it. It's still total savagery, utter barbarism." "But that is a short-term view, and one which does not take into consideration all the factors in the equation. What is the purpose back of this savagery, if it is not to force men to learn and to grow? What if this so-called savagery is also the result of ignorance, of an entity trying desperately to learn how to solve a problem, but never quite succeeding?" "But surely there must be some way which does not involve so much suffering," Zen protested. He was growing more and more uncomfortable. It was his impression that he was shifting sides in the argument without quite realizing he was doing it. Or perhaps West was the one who was shifting sides. This side-changing was producing confusion in his thinking. "I have harbored the same hope," West answered. "However, I know of no way to accomplish this result. In a human being, we have a growing, evolving organism that is possessed of a keen brain and a vast curiosity. Such an organism, by its very nature, will have to try every possible road." West pressed a button. Again the screen came to life. Dim and shadowy, human figures began to move there. Kurt Zen leaned forward to see them more clearly. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Doomsday Eve by Robert Moore Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doomsday Eve. Chapter 10. At first, the figures were indistinct, and Zen could not see them clearly. He mentioned this to West. "They will get sharper in a minute," the craggy man answered. His voice had sunk to a whisper heard from afar. Zen glanced at him to make certain he was still there. The colonel had the flickering impression that the chair was vacant, but before the impression could firm itself, West, faster than the eyes could follow, seemed to be back in the chair. "Note the screen now, Kurt," West said. The figures had become clear. It seemed to be a view of some kind of underground cavern, where men were working on an object that looked like... Zen squinted his eyes to make certain. "A small spaceship," the colonel said. He felt eagerness rise in his voice. Like so many kids born in the age of science, he had harbored the dream of the days to come when men would fly beyond the sky, to storied space islands that lay afar. Science had promised that this would happen, and the fiction writers had embellished this belief with dream worlds. Somehow it had never come to pass. One problem after another had prevented realization of this dream. The war, which should have accelerated development, had stopped it completely. Neither side had the materials or the engineers or the skilled technicians to construct a vessel capable of spaceflight. "No," West said. His voice was toneless, and the faraway note was still strong in it. "Sorry to contradict you, Colonel, but that is not a small spaceship, though it is designed to get out of the atmosphere for a short time. Look again." "Hell, it's a super bomb," Zen gasped as recognition came to him. "Right, Colonel." "A bomb big enough to devastate a continent." Cold current suddenly flurried at the base of Zen's spine. "Right, Colonel." West's voice was as dry as the Nevada wind. "I didn't know we had such a bomb under construction," Zen blurted out. "We haven't." "Then who? Where?" The cold currents at the base of Zen's back were flowing down both legs and up his spine. "Look at the men, Colonel. Look closely." West's voice was also cold. "They're Asiatics." Shouting the words, Zen was out of his chair. "I didn't see the yellow faces and the slanted eyes at first. West, that's a huge guided missile. It's being built to drop out of the sky at thousands of miles an hour on us." "Yes," West said. He did not move a muscle in his body. On the other side of Kurt Zen, Nedra sat equally silent and motionless. "I have to get out of here," Zen said. "This information must be reported to the General Staff at once." Urgency pounded in the tones of his voice. "The new people do not fight," West said. "I thought you were one of us." "It doesn't matter who I am," Zen said quickly. "The building of this super bomb must be reported. It must be. Extra warnings must be issued. We must alert every Z-type fighter we possess and have them in the air constantly, in the hope that we can destroy this bomb before it lands. We've got to follow the construction hourly, so we will know when it is ready to be launched. And that means we've got to have top flight intelligence men here to follow the building of that bomb every inch of the way. Or we've got to take this super radar of yours to headquarters and use it there. That's the best solution, if it is at all practical. Zen was striding back and forth in the darkened room, planning the steps that had to be taken. West, do you realize this super radar of yours will win the war? Excitement tightened the colonel's voice. With it, the enemy won't be able to make a move that we don't know about in advance. His excitement grew as the vast longing hidden in him for the end of the war tried to come to the surface. "You have tears in your eyes, Colonel," West said. "You're out of your mind," Zen retorted. But he knew the craggy man was speaking the truth. He swallowed harder. "We've got the Asians cold. We'll know every move they make in advance." He exulted as he realized again how much this meant. "I have always known every move they made in advance," West answered. "We'll have them on their knees in—" "Huh? What was that you just said? What was that?" Desperation appeared in the colonel's voice. West repeated his words. "Then why didn't you warn us?" Zen felt each word sting as it left his lips. "Why didn't you warn us? Why did you let so many of us die so unnecessarily?" West did not answer. The silence in the room grew deeper. Cold had begun to appear in the air. On the screen, the silent figures continued busily engaged in the building of their bomb. "Don't you realize that your failure to report what you knew is high treason?" Zen continued. The silence grew. West sat as solid and as immobile as a mountain. Nedra seemed to have shrunk in upon herself still farther. More than ever, she looked like a very small girl who had somehow managed to intrude into a world of adults and was tremendously confused and hurt by what was happening here. "Don't you hear me?" Zen said. "I hear you," West answered. "Your loyalty to your country does you credit, Colonel. It is to be expected from a person in your stage of development. However, you seem to have forgotten that I am not a citizen of your country. Or perhaps you did not know this?" "Not a citizen?" Zen said. "But this mountain exists in America. I don't know whether it is actually on Canadian ground or lies in the United States, but this does not matter. By mutual treaty, the countries have become one nation. A citizen of one is automatically a citizen of the other." "True, Colonel." West did not attempt to explain. "Then what country do you claim to belong to?" Zen felt his voice falter as he tried to grasp what lay back of this very strange man. "You talk like an American." "I was born here." "Then you are a citizen." "No. I resigned my citizenship. As to my real country, it is a far land. I am sure you have no knowledge of it. My loyalty, Colonel, is not to any nation on the face of the globe, but is to growth, to the new people who will come into existence one day." As West spoke, the cold that was freezing Zen's spine suddenly disappeared and was replaced by a sudden deep warmth. The words seemed to touch some hidden spring of warmth within him. "My loyalty is to the future, to the growing tip of the life force, to what the human race will become, not to what it is today. Only the future has meaning, Colonel, and to the building of that future I have dedicated my life." In spite of the fact that the words thrilled him, Zen knew he had to deny them. "This is sophistry," he snapped. "I think any court in the land would hold it to be evasion of your proper duties. You can't continue living in a country and enjoying its Confusion came into Zen's mind. "Were you going to say blessings, Colonel?" West said, almost maliciously. Yes. Would you point out these blessings? We had them once, Zen said, and we're going to have them again. Are you? West nodded toward the screen where the far-off enemy technicians and engineers were busy with their super bomb. Now that we know that it exists, that bomb will never land, Zen said. I'll see to that personally. How are you going to discharge this responsibility? West inquired. I'll find a way, Zen answered. I admire your spirit, Colonel, though not necessarily your evaluation of your personal position at this moment. Also, there is one other thing that I want you to see. The screen went blank. Slowly, another scene formed on it. Zen, staring, blurted out words. That's another one. They're making 2 of those super bombs. I didn't think they had the materials and the technical know-how to make even one. This doubles the problem, and more than doubles the urgency. We'll have to guard the skyways from all directions, including straight up. Damn it, West! Zen slapped his fist into his open palm to emphasize his feelings of urgency. Look again, Colonel, the craggy man invited. On second look, Zen saw something that he had missed before. Those are Americans. We're building that bomb. His words were little gusts of explosive sound in the quiet room. Right, West said. His voice was very grim. Then, it's a race to see which side gets its bomb built first? Zen asked. He did not know whether or not he liked what his eyes were seeing and the interpretation his mind was giving him. I am afraid that is true, West reluctantly agreed. But doesn't that change the picture, Colonel? How? Zen demanded. We're going to win a war. We've got to win it. The words were firmly spoken, but somewhere a lingering doubt remained, as if some point had not been considered. The other side also thinks it has to win, West pointed out. To hell with what they think. They started it. We didn't. Man, you don't intend to tell me you're going to sit right here and watch 2 nations frantically try to destroy each other, and maybe the Earth with them, when you have the means to stop it in your hand? Horror exploded in Zen's words. I am going to do just that, West stated. His voice was as firm and as solid as the granite core of a mountain. But you can't, Zen expostulated. Why can't I? West demanded. I am not a citizen of either country, and I owe nothing to any nation. Even if you are not a citizen of either country, you're still a human being. You owe loyalty to your own race, Zen said. The craggy man showed faint signs of discomfort, but when he spoke, his voice was still imperturbable. Granting your statement, what do you propose I do? Stop the Asians, Zen answered promptly. Give us complete information on the location of their super bomb. We'll make certain we get ours finished first, and we'll use it to blow their installation out of existence. At the moment, his plan seemed feasible. That would create the very danger you are trying to avoid, would it not? West pointed out. Both super bombs would explode simultaneously. Do you think the Earth would remain in its orbit if this happened? I don't know, Zen answered. That would be up to the astronomers and the astronomical physicists to decide. In any case, if the danger is too great, we'll use ordinary weapons to touch off their super bomb. We'll get the job done before they finish. They are working underground, in a cavern at least 3,000 feet deep, West pointed out. Do you have a weapon that will penetrate to this depth? We'll build one. You talk very glibly, Colonel. Somebody has got to talk, Zen said fiercely. Even if they are building their bomb underground, they must have an exit for it somewhere. We'll locate their exit and drop an H-bomb on it. And thus destroy their bomb and the rest of their scientists and engineers? This is war. You can't have sympathy in war. This is my point, Colonel, West said patiently. I have no sympathy with either side. Then what do you propose? To sit here and do nothing? I propose to let each side destroy the other as much as they wish and can. Then, when they have completely demonstrated the futility of their efforts, when it is utterly clear to the few who have survived that warfare is not the way to the future, then the new people will emerge to show the way to those who have survived. West's voice was calm. He seemed to be considering a situation often pondered and to be stating a conclusion firmly and definitely reached. But that involves senseless slaughter, Zen protested. This was the reason that lay back of the dropping of the first atom bomb, to stop senseless slaughter. All slaughter is senseless, Colonel. From the viewpoint of the individual or nation doing it, slaughter is generally considered to be right at the time. Zen started to comment on what the craggy man had just said, then changed his mind. Was he dealing with a madman? This seemed possible. West's words certainly did not fit any pattern that Zen knew. The act of sitting by and letting two nations commit suicide went beyond the bounds of rational thinking. I beg you, let me report this to the High Command, Zen said, making one last plea. In reply, I want to ask one question, West answered. What would happen to the people here, and to me, if I revealed the existence of this instrument? You would be a hero, Zen said promptly, and knew he was lying as he spoke. Your people would be protected. I dislike calling you a liar, Colonel, but that is exactly what you are, West answered. We would all be taken care of, as long as all of us did exactly what the High Command wanted. The instant I tried to do anything else, my actions would be called treason, and I would be considered a traitor. My equipment would be confiscated for the convenience of the government, and I would be lucky if I did not face a firing squad. Tell me honestly, Colonel, would not this happen? For the first time, West's words had a tinge of anger in them. Or was it sorrow? Sam, Nedra said. Something... Her voice was a whisper from some far-off land. What is it, Nedra? West asked. In an instant, he had forgotten all about Kurt Zen. The nurse sat up straight and stiff. All color fled from her face. Something... Her voice was the faintest whisper of sound in this quiet room. Nedra, what is it? West's tones had alarm in them. Instead of answering, the nurse slid from her chair to the floor in a faint. Dim and distant in the silence that followed came a popping sound. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat. Zen had heard this death-dealing rattle too often to mistake its identity. A submachine gun. The drapes that covered the archway leading into this hidden room were shoved aside. A man fell through them. Zen knew at a glance that he was another of the kids who lived here in this hidden cavern inside a mountain. Blood was spewing from a hole in his back, and he was fighting desperately for breath. "They're coming with guns," he gasped. West dropped to his knees and took the head of the youth in his lap. His face was dark as he saw the wound on the back. Cuddling the youth's head in his lap as one would a frightened child, he asked, "What happened, Carl?" "I don't know. They came out of nowhere. There was no one. Then these men were here. They came shooting." Blood came out of his mouth as he spoke. He tried to cough it away and failed. His hand went to his mouth and wiped at the blood. Then he lifted his hand to his eyes and saw what was there. "How many are there?" Zen asked. Carl's eyes wandered until he found the source of this question. "Dozens," he said, his voice dull. Blood was draining from his mouth across West's legs and was forming a pool on the floor. Listening, Zen could distinguish 3 machine guns going now. Men were yelling, a girl was screaming. At the sounds, the colonel's lips formed into a line as sharp as the edge of a knife. "How did they get past your fear generators?" he said to West. "I don't know," the craggy man answered. "Perhaps they found an unguarded tunnel." Zen could not see what difference it made how the intruders had secured entry. They were here. "Where are your weapons?" he demanded. In his mind was the thought that the new people would have weapons adequate to defend their own citadel. Weapons? West did not seem to understand the term. "We have none." "What?" Zen said. Hadn't West understood him? Every farmer, every rancher, and every householder had his stock of weapons. Almost all people went armed. No rifles? No. Not even tear gas? No, Colonel. Then how in the hell did you expect to stay alive? Zen burst out. You surely knew they would find you sometime. Staying alive is actually not as important as you think. Yes, son? West bent again to listen to the youth's words. Good. Good. The whisper was very faint. West understood. Goodbye, he said. We will meet again. But goodbye for now. The youth sighed. All pain and all fear went from his face. Peace came to him. But when West rose to his feet, his face was bleak. He was new here, he said, as if this explained something that he felt needed explaining. Somewhere a woman was screaming. West listened to the sound, then started toward it. Zen caught his arm. The invaders have guns. His tone conveyed the impression that West was at fault because no weapons existed inside the mine. Or do you want to go join him? He nodded toward the body on the floor. Blood had stopped spilling from that body now. The essence of life had gone elsewhere, and the tides of life had ceased flowing. Yes, West said bluntly. I want to go with him. His face had grown more black. Heat lightning was dancing in his eyes. Zen caught the impulse to say that this made two of them who wanted to join the bronze-skinned youth. He knew how to deal with this reaction. Okay, he said. Goodbye. West blinked startled eyes at him. Run along, Zen said. Eh? I'll take over here and fight the battle you're running from, Zen continued. As if he were dispelling a mist from some hidden corner of his mind, the craggy man shook his head. Sorry, he apologized. However, the call is very strong. Only the sense of a job not yet done has kept me from going for a long time. He shook his head again. No, I shall not follow him for another while, though I am positive that he is luckier than we are. I agree, Zen said. Stooping, West picked up Nedra. She lay in his arms like a tired, sleeping child. Had she followed the youth? Kurt Zen had a moment of heartbreak as the thought passed through his mind before he saw that she was still breathing regularly. Follow me, West said. The heat lightning still danced in the eyes of the craggy man as he moved across the room. The solid wall swung aside to another hidden door. None of my people know this is here, he explained. The combination lock is actuated only by my body. As Kurt Zen went through the door, he could hear the girl still screaming somewhere. The passage was narrow. To one side, another passage led into a room where Zen caught a glimpse of some kind of electrical equipment in operation, the technical guts of the super radar he suspected. Ahead, West growled, a sound that came from deep in his throat. He had stopped and was staring down into a hidden opening in the wall. Zen saw that the opening, through some hidden arrangement of mirrors, revealed the interior of the big gallery where he had spent the night. Hell was loose in there now. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Doomsday Eve by Robert Moore Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doomsday Eve, Chapter 11. Jake, Ed, and Cal were part of that hell. Each carried a smoking weapon in his hands. A body lay on the floor. Somewhere in one of the small rooms a woman was screaming. In the middle of the room stood the man who was obviously in charge of the situation. At the sight of this man, Kurt Zen felt his breath draw into his body so heavily that it whistled through his nostrils. Kuso's lieutenant. The others in the room were the Asians who had been with the lieutenant the night before. "I should have slit their throats while they were asleep and in my power last night," Zen raged. The only sound in the passage was that of West breathing heavily, like a man who had run a marathon and had lost. No, there were two men. Additional shock came up in Kurt Zen when he realized he was the second man. He seized the craggy man by the shoulder. "West, they can't have that super radar. If we lose that, we have lost the war." The craggy man did not move. Anguish grew in Zen's voice. "If we lose this one, it will be the first war we have ever lost, and the last one. Nothing will remain to come after us except death and desolation." "I know," West said. "The race soul will have to start over, in the swamps and on the mudflats, trying to rebuild the race with tools long since worn out and out of place in time." Again, the tones of a bell were in his voice, but now the bell was tolling the death of a people, wailing that the glory that once had been was truly gone, wailing that the brave world that some men had tried to build was going into ashes and into doom. "Do you believe in the race soul too?" West gasped. "Belief is too weak a word. I know it exists." Nedra sighed in West's arms and opened her eyes. Seeing who was holding her, she lay back in the arms of the craggy man, more than ever like a tired child. "What was it?" she whispered. "What's wrong? I took a little nap." West set her on her feet and pointed at the opening. She clutched at the stone wall as she saw what was happening inside. Running, the bronze girl who had danced to the slow music the night before came fleeing from a room. One of Kuso's soldiers was pursuing her. She fled like a deer before some great hound that was interested in pulling her down, but she did not flee fast enough. The soldier caught her and dragged her back into a room. "West, how many of these kids did you have here?" Zen asked. "About 50, the craggy man answered. "I don't know how many are left, nor can I guess how many will choose to stay alive if they are conquered before their training is completed." "And no weapons?" "None." "What about my gun that was taken from me while I slept?" "What good would one gun do now?" "None, I guess," Zen said helplessly. "But as they try to run me down, I'd like to have it in my hands. I'd at least take a few of them with me before they got me." "We will survive," West said, his voice a mumble. Zen pointed through the opening to the bodies lying on the floor below them. "They didn't," he said. The craggy man groaned. "If I had time, I would try to explain to you that survival does not lie in the body and can never be achieved there." Zen answered, "I have no time for metaphysics. For purposes of defense, I'm taking command." He felt foolish as he spoke. What resources were his to command? What troops? What weapons? He knew the answer as the thought crossed his mind. If he only had the remnants of the broken column moving down the mountains after its disaster encounter with Kuso's blooper. An idea came into his mind. Perhaps he could have these troops. "Where's my pack?" he demanded. His radio equipment was in that. "It went with your gun into the deep hole," West said. "The deep hole is a fault the old miners uncovered here. It's miles deep." He shook his head. "Damn," Kurt Zen said. The depression in him was as deep as the fault in the mountain. "Isn't there any place where we can hide?" "Many places," West said. "This whole mountain is a honeycomb of tunnels and shafts. We have explored 15 separate levels, and there are others which lie below the present waterline." He did not protest at Zen's statement that the latter was taking command, but seemed willing to submit to the colonel's authority, and also interested in seeing how Zen would handle the problem. "Then find us a place to hide until we can decide what to do to eliminate Kuso's men. A hiding hole first, then radio equipment. As soon as I can gain access to shortwave transmitting equipment, I can have a regiment of paratroopers on their way here." "You sound as if you have authority," Nedra commented. "I have." "But you gave me the impression you were a deserter." "They haven't discovered that yet at headquarters. As far as they are concerned, I'm on a secret mission, and I haven't deserted the human race." Zen put sting into his words. The implication was that the two people present were really deserters. "Ah, well, Colonel, we shall see about that." West had recovered most of his aplomb. Again, he seemed to be observing from a great distance the antics of this strange species called human. But his face remained bleak, and his eyes had flickers of lightning in them. He started away from the opening, and stopped as metal clanged ahead of them. A door opened there. An Asian soldier with his rifle at the ready came through. A second one followed the first. The rifles of both covered West. Zen jerked his arms toward the roof. Neither the craggy man nor Nedra moved a muscle. Slowly, West and Nedra raised their hands. At gunpoint, the two soldiers herded them toward the main gallery. At the sight of them, the lieutenant hastily called Cal to him. "Is this the one?" he demanded, pointing at West. "That's him," Cal answered. "He's the leader here. He's the one you want." Elation appeared as a shockwave on the yellow face of the Asian lieutenant. Calling two men to him, he had West step aside, treating the craggy man with respect that bordered on deference, but also with great firmness. "You two stand against the wall with the others," he said to Nedra and Kurt Zen. There was no deference in his voice as he spoke to them. "If they move, shoot them," he ordered his men. As Kurt and Nedra obeyed, the lieutenant drew West to one side and began a conversation with him. His men were still busy searching the old mine tunnels. Now and then, they brought more captives to the main gallery. Cal, Jake, and Ed remained in the center of the big room. Cal was trying to look important, but the expression on his face indicated he was hiding guilt pangs somewhere inside. As soon as he saw Nedra, Ed's eyes became fixed on her, though he did not look at her face. Jake's murky eyes were roving the chamber. He did not seem to comprehend what he was seeing, but seemed to be living in some other world that was even more confusing and more clouded than this one. The bronze girl, utterly naked, came limping into the gallery from one of the small rooms. She had a dazed expression on her face, and she looked around the room as if she could not comprehend what was happening. At the sight of her, the lieutenant left off talking to West for a moment, his eyes glowing. But his conversation with West was more important than his lust. He motioned with his gun for the bronze girl to take her place against the wall. She stared at him as if she did not understand him. He waved the gun again. Some dull comprehension of his meaning penetrated her mind. She stumbled to the wall, but fell face downward on the stone floor. Nedra, with a little cry of pity on her lips, moved quickly to the side of the bronze girl. Zen started to move, then stopped, but not because the rifle of one of the guards was swinging up to menace him. Nedra gave a quick examination of the girl, then got slowly to her feet. "Dead?" Zen said. "Yes, but how did you know?" "Just a hunch." "What caused it? Shock?" "I imagine so. After she was violated, she wanted to die. So she really died because she wanted to. I... Tears appeared in Nedra's violet eyes and ran down her cheeks. But she did not sob, though muscles moved in her throat. West glanced at the bronze girl. He seemed to know, without being told, what had happened. His face became bleak. The lieutenant regarded the body of the dead girl with regret. When the soldier who had violated her came out of the room, the lieutenant ordered him to remove the body. Zen got the impression that the lieutenant, even though he was talking earnestly with the craggy man, was waiting. 40 of the new people were herded into the room and forced to stand against the walls. Bronze striplings they were. Not a one was out of his 20s, and several were obviously in their teens. Though they were confused, they kept silent. "Is this all?" Zen heard the lieutenant ask West. The craggy man must have known at a glance the answer to this question, but he took the time to count every person. "This is all," he said positively. The lieutenant seemed to believe him, but Zen would have given odds that the man was lying. The lieutenant continued to wait. A guard, entering hastily, saluted. When Zen saw who was following the soldier, he realized why the lieutenant had been waiting. Kuso came into the gallery. The Asian leader was a giant, almost 7 feet tall and big in proportion. He looked capable of killing a man with his bare hands, and probably was. Just looking at him, Zen knew why he had been selected to lead the airborne landing in America. Radiating power and strength, he was the type for this kind of mission. Besides power, he radiated something else. Zen sensed this something else as a sickening feeling at the pit of his stomach, a tightening of muscles in the diaphragm. When Kuso appeared, the lieutenant stiffened himself to attention and almost broke his arm saluting. He and Kuso spoke together in a sing-song dialect that Zen did not pretend to understand. As they talked, the lieutenant continued to point at West. A grin broke out on Kuso's face. He beckoned the craggy man to him. The craggy man approached, but did not salute. Prisoners were not permitted to salute. Nor did he get down on his hands and knees, which was not only permitted, but required among the Asians. West stood arrow straight. In spite of his disagreements with him, Zen felt proud of Sam West now. Kuso was grinning placatingly, but in spite of the grin, West surely knew that he was looking at death, that the slightest show of resistance on his part would have only one result, although Kuso might save him until he had wrung all possible information out of him. Zen did not in the least doubt that information was what the Asian wanted first. After that, there was the tradition of torturing helpless prisoners. "I have heard much about you," Kuso said. For an Asian, he spoke fair English. "I am greatly honored," West answered. "However, I am curious as to how you heard about me." A sly grin flitted across the Asian's face. "We have our sources of information." "Spies?" West asked. "We have spies, of course, but they could not find out much about you. There are other ways. How do you say it?" "Clairvoyance?" West asked. "Yes, that is right." Kuso looked pleased to be given the right word. He also looked startled because he had been given the right fact. Zen, listening, was surprised too. He knew that the suggestion to use clairvoyance to find out what the enemy was doing had often been made. As an intelligence officer, he had investigated several clairvoyants who had volunteered for this purpose. He knew that such a project had been set up, but he did not know what the results had been, if any. However, to learn that the enemy had not only entertained the same ideas, but had used them with some success, startled him. "I suspected clairvoyance," West said. "Ah," Kuso said. "Did you also suspect that the only reason this airborne landing was made on these shores was to capture you?" Even West's perfect control of his features could not hide the start of surprise at these words. "I am not that important," he said. Kuso smiled deprecatingly, and made a little gesture with his hand which said that such modesty was becoming in the truly great. Oddly, Zen had the impression that the Asian leader meant this. "As to that, I have the great privilege of offering you a commission as a field marshal in the armies of the United Asia." His voice dripped oil and oil because he was selling, awe because he was truly impressed by the rank of field marshal. Perhaps as a result of the successful achievement of this difficult mission, even he might have this rank. Hunger thickened on Kuso's face as he thought of this. West blinked, then smiled back at Kuso. "That is interesting. But what makes you think I would be interested in such a commission, or in any commission, in your armies?" "For protection, for one reason," Kuso answered promptly. "Our reports indicate that you are not a citizen of any country. Since this leaves you with no friends to protect you, this is an undesirable position. On the other hand, since you belong to no one, Every country feels that you are an enemy. Because of this, your life is constantly in danger. However, holding our commission, you are automatically a citizen of United Asia, and thus are under our protection." Kuzo spoke as if being a citizen of United Asia was important, and that holding a commission in its armies was even more so. "Do you think I have no friends?" West asked. "Well, you are not a citizen of—" "Why do you think I need protection?" West continued. The oily smile slid off the giant Asian's face. For an instant, the wild beast underneath showed through. "Perhaps you do not need protection personally, but under the circumstances, as I have outlined them, our mantle would automatically extend to the people working with you." His eyes went around the room to the youths standing rigidly against the wall. In this circuit, his gaze flicked contemptuously past the corpses lying on the floor. The face of the craggy man got bleak again. He understood only too well what lay back of Kuso's words. "I see what you mean. But what do you wish of me?" His voice carried an intimation of surrender in the face of odds that he recognized as being hopeless. Zen, with his back to the wall, tried to keep from squirming. Emotions that were causing actual pain were in his body. Why would the race mind permit such an outrage as this? The smile on Kuso's face went from ear to ear. Here was victory. Here was the submission of the enemy. Here was what his leaders wanted. Here was a marshal's baton for him. "Really, very little." He drew in his breath with a hiss as he addressed West, a sign of deferent politeness. "Merely that you show us what you have here, and of course that you should explain it all to our scientists and engineers, showing them how your equipment operates." The room got very quiet after Kuso had finished speaking. Wes seemed to muse. "What do you think we have here?" he said. "If I knew the answer to that question, I would not be asking such a stupid thing," Kuso answered. "Quite true," West agreed. "I was stupid to even ask such a question." "The time is here to end stupidity," Kuso said. "Again I agree," the craggy man answered. He shrugged. "Well, when and where do you want me to start?" The smile on his face was a mixture of fear and resignation. It indicated that he had given up completely. "Now you are talking the kind of words I like to hear," Kuso said emphatically. "You will start now and show me, personally, everything that is of importance in this mountain." "Very well. Follow me." West turned and moved toward the opening that led to the chamber where the super radar was hidden. "Wait here," Kuso snapped at his lieutenant. "Shoot any person who moves." "Yes, Great One," the lieutenant answered, saluting. This was the kind of order he loved to obey. Kuso and West went out of sight. Jake, Cal, and Ed stood in the middle of the room. Ed approached the lieutenant, nodded toward Nedra, and spoke earnestly to the man. The lieutenant shook his head vigorously, a gesture which seemed to indicate that Ed was being very stupid. The bantam grumbled to himself and moved away. Out of the corners of his eyes, he kept watching the nurse. Nedra ignored him. She also ignored Kurt Zen. As silent as so many statues, the new people stood against the stone walls. They seemed stunned. The impossible had happened to them, and they were having difficulty in adjusting to it. John was not in the room. Either he had succeeded in hiding, or he had been killed. The fat youth was standing directly across the gallery from Zen. Farther down the wall, clad in pants and a bra, was a shapely blonde. When he was not watching Nedra, Ed paid attention to her. His actions seemed to irritate the lieutenant. Lifting his rifle, he fired a single shot through the head of the bantam. Ed collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. 2 Asian soldiers carried the body away. "That lieutenant is hell on lovers," Zen whispered. Nedra did not answer him. Her face was pale, and her breathing was shallow. A film of sweat glistened on her forehead. Glancing at her, Zen had the impression that she was listening. For what, he wondered? The only thing that was left for any of them was the sounding of the trump of doom. Zen had no illusions that Kuso would keep his promises for any longer than was expedient. First, West and all the others must be pumped dry of information. The whole interior of the mountain must be thoroughly explored. Then, more bodies for the deep hole. Zen had no illusions that either West or the new people would long survive the information they could be forced to divulge. As to Kuso's talk of West being given a commission as a Marshal of the Asian Federation for protection, the colonel knew that Asian field marshals had been listed among the missing before now. A field marshal who fell from grace vanished. Across the gallery, the fat youth also vanished. 1 second he was there, the next second he was gone. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Doomsday Eve by Robert Moore Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doomsday Eve, Chapter 12. Neither the lieutenant nor any of the Asians noticed that a man had vanished. Cal and Jake, with the memory of Ed's death still very fresh in their minds, were engaged in making themselves inconspicuous. As far as Zen could tell, none of these clean, tall kids knew anything out of the ordinary had happened. Beside the colonel, Nedra seemed slightly more composed. Her eyes were blank, as if she were not seeing. The thin film of moisture was still visible on her forehead. Zen started to whisper to her, to ask her if she had noticed anything different, then changed his mind. There was no point in taking such a risk at such a time. A sound was in the room, a thin, high note that was close to the upper limits of hearing. It passed beyond the range of hearing, or diminished in volume, then came again with the frequency of the ears, moving like a microscopically small but very powerful honeybee. Had the sound been present all the time, or had it come into existence just before the fat youth vanished? Zen did not know about the sound. A face appeared in the middle of the room. About 10 feet above the floor, it looked around briefly, then vanished. Cal seemed to see it too. A startled expression appeared on the face of the ragged man. His eyes opened wide. He blinked them hastily when the face vanished, then looked furtively around the room. Jake said very loudly to the face, "Hi, bud. Long time no see. Where you been?" "Shut up, you crazy head," Cal snarled at him. "But I just saw an old buddy," Jake tried to explain. "You saw nothing." "What are you two talking about?" the lieutenant demanded. "Nothing," Cal answered. He pointed his finger at his forehead and made circling motions in the air, then nodded toward Jake. "You know he's a loony, Lieutenant." "Oh, yes," the Asian officer said, as if he had just remembered something. Again he lifted the rifle to his shoulder. Jake fell dead. The lieutenant slid another cartridge into his rifle. "As long as you needed us," Cal began. "But I no longer need you to help me find the hidden ones," the lieutenant answered. "That makes things different, doesn't it?" "It sure does," Cal agreed. "But why did you shoot him?" "I made up my mind months ago to shoot him as soon as I no longer needed him," the Asian officer answered. "He was too crazy to trust." "But he found this place for you and got you past those hell generators," Cal said. "That is true, but the place is now found and we are past the odd devices that make weaklings afraid." His tone said that this also made the situation different, and that the ragged man had better understand this and guide himself accordingly. Cal started to speak, then changed his mind. "What were you two talking about?" the Asian asked. "He said he saw a face in the air," the ragged man answered. "I told him that he was nuts and to shut up." "Was there a face?" "I didn't see anything," Cal answered. While the two were talking, Zen was watching a youth in a loincloth across the room. Standing erect against the wall, looking as if he were being crucified there, but without making any sound, the youth was slowly vanishing. While the youth was sliding away, the violin note throbbed softly in the air. As he vanished, it went into silence, ending on a note of triumph. The lieutenant became suspicious. He scanned the people against the wall. "I thought there were more," he muttered. Slowly, he counted them. 38, he said. As if to engrave the number on his memory, he repeated it. Simultaneously, one of the Asian soldiers spoke to him in a swift flow of sound. Zen could not understand what was being said, but he guessed from the way the soldier pointed to the spot where the fat youth had stood that he was reporting what he had seen happen. While they were talking, the face appeared again in the air high in the middle of the room. The face was that of a man. He was wearing a mustache, and he looked around the room with alert brown eyes. Nodding to himself with apparent satisfaction, he vanished. Down the wall from Zen, a young woman vanished. She went rapidly in the flicker of an eye. A youth standing next in line to her followed suit. Turning, the lieutenant saw that something had happened. Hastily, he counted those standing against the wall. 36. Who slipped out while my back was turned? As he asked the question, 3 of the new people vanished behind him. No one answered him. He turned again and realized that more blank places had appeared while he was not looking. Again, keeping behind him, another one of the new people vanished. Watching, Zen was treated to the spectacle of seeing an Asian officer grow crazy. While the lieutenant was watching one particular person, nothing happened to the one under his scrutiny. But directly behind him, a person flicked out of existence. For a time, the lieutenant almost had Zen's sympathy. The colonel knew what would happen to this officer when Kuso returned and found his prey had been permitted to escape. The Asians were not known for leniency to their own men who failed in assigned duty. The lieutenant knew as well as Zen what would happen to him, but he was helpless. No matter which way he looked, his back was always turned to someone. The person he was not watching vanished. Unnoticed by the lieutenant, the face that seemed to be directing the vanishing operation appeared and disappeared in the center of the room. It kept directly above the lieutenant's head, moving as he moved, vanishing as he looked up. The note of the violin came into hearing and went out again, repeating this action time and time again. Sweat dripped off Zen's chin and formed a puddle on the floor under him. He did not know what was happening. Terror that was close to panic was in him, but he did not move a muscle. For all he knew, the face might look at him, and he might be the next one to vanish. Where would he find himself if he vanished? Would he find himself again? Or did these people slide forever into nothingness, into some dimensional interspace where there was no Earth, no moon, and no stars? Only he and Nedra were left along the walls. The others had vanished. The lieutenant had gone completely crazy. Sputtering a mixture of Chinese and English, he was jabbing his rifle against Nedra's stomach and was yelling at her. "Tsi, go away. I will kill you if you do. No 10. Where did they go? I demand an answer. Speak." "I do not know," the girl answered. "Speak. I command it. Kuso will have my throat slit if I let all of you get away." "I have already—" The lieutenant jabbed the muzzle of his rifle against her stomach. "If you go away, I will kill you." He meant what he said. Smiling at him, the girl vanished. He pulled the trigger of the weapon. The bullets howled madly through the gallery. Zen dropped hastily to the floor. Death was too close for him to be amazed at the sight of an Asian officer shooting at nothing. The lieutenant stopped shooting when the magazine was empty. As he clicked another clip into place, some measure of sanity seemed to return to him. He did not shoot the colonel. Instead, Zen found himself being prodded with the muzzle of the still hot and smoking rifle. "If you go away—" Zen got to his feet. "If I knew how to do it, I'd be gone," he said. "Where did they go? How did they do it?" Fine flecks of spittle were blown from the lieutenant's lips. The sound of hot lead was still strong in Zen's ears. At any moment, the lieutenant might start shooting again for any reason, or for no reason. "I don't know," Zen said. "But you've got to know. You're one of them." "Would I stand around here and let you shoot me if I was one of them?" Zen answered. Some of the logic of the question must have penetrated to the officer's mad mind. "No, you wouldn't. That is, I guess you wouldn't. But you might be trying to trick me." The thought of being tricked seemed to bring all his fury to the surface. "You did it once before, you and the girl." "How?" Zen demanded. "You put us all to sleep, you and that girl. Don't tell me you didn't. I was there." "I was there, but I didn't have a damn thing to do with it, and neither did the girl." "Then who did?" "West. He was outside with some kind of a sleep generator that operated electronically." Doubt came over the lieutenant's face. How was he to know if this tall, thin Yankee was telling the truth? In his book, all Americans were liars. Why trust this one? "If you lied to me, I know you'll shoot me, and I'll return from the other world and strangle you some night while you sleep." The shot went home. Like most Asians, this officer was superstitious. Watching the reaction, Zen wondered if this man would ever again dare to go to sleep at night. The deadly Dugfas, the devil souls of the departed, might strangle him in a spirit noose the instant he closed his eyes. On the other hand, there was Kuso. The lieutenant knew what the Asian leader would do to him. Zen could see him making up his mind that it was better to take a chance on the deadly devils that roamed the darkness than on Kuso. The night devils might miss. "You lie!" The lieutenant lifted the rifle. At the same instant, Kuso and West entered. The lieutenant lowered the rifle. Hastily, he approached his chief and saluted. Then, taking as few chances as possible, he prostrated himself on the floor. Reaching for Kuso's foot, he tried to place it on his neck as a token of submission. Kuso kicked him in the face. The Asian leader's eyes ranged the room. He saw instantly that his prisoners were missing. His eyes turned green. He kicked the lieutenant in the face again and demanded to know what had happened. The luckless officer broke into a stream of tight, sing-song language. Now and then, he waved his hand as if to say that they had been here but had gone away. "The Dugfast took them!" he screamed in English. Kuso kicked him in the throat this time. He had no belief in night devils. He did not think they could spirit live people away, and he was not afraid of them. Another burst of broken, impassioned speech came from the lieutenant's lips. Listening to the sound, watching the contortions in the officer's body, Zen thought with some satisfaction that Ed and Jake were being avenged. Not that they deserved vengeance. They had gotten exactly what was coming to them. West remained aloof. He glanced around the room, but no flicker of surprise showed on his face. Did he know what had happened here? Kuso, listening to his lieutenant, glanced once at the craggy man, a look that was pure suspicious hatred. If it had been possible, Kuso would have had West skinned alive then and there. Too much was at stake for that. A flayed man could not reveal his secrets. He could only die. Kuso left off kicking his lieutenant and trying to listen to him at the same time. He turned to West. "It seems that your people have departed," he said. "At least they do not seem to be here," the craggy man answered. Again his voice had the deep boom of a bell in it. "That is interesting," Kuso said. "I find it so," West answered. "How was it done?" West spread his hands in a gesture that said something or nothing. "Perhaps it would be best to ask them." "You know." The words were a statement, not a question. "It could be," West answered. "Then how?" Kuso's words sounded like the snap of a bear trap closing. "I want to know how it was done. No alibis, no evasions, no excuses, just the truth." The tone of his voice carried the threat of violence with it. West smiled. "Have I alibied or evaded? Did you not see everything in our center here?" "I saw many things. That I saw all, I do not know." "You saw what the colonel here," the craggy man nodded toward Zen, "called my super radar." "Did you show him that?" Zen demanded. "Of course. I have no secrets from the great Asian. Besides, has he not promised me a commission as a marshal in the armed forces of his land?" The words were easily spoken, but Zen knew that West was actually stalling for time. What was he waiting for? Was it the appearance again of the face that had looked from the air in the center of the room? Were the vanished people to reappear, armed with new weapons, and take the Asians prisoners? "To hell with his commission," Zen shouted. "He'll never make good on his promise." "Shut up, both of you!" Kuso shouted. His voice was a bull bellow of sound that roared back from the walls of the gallery and was echoed from the tunnels that led outward. "You are stalling! You are trying to trick me!" West was silent. "My dog here says the people vanished." Kuso kicked his lieutenant again to indicate who was meant. "Howl, dog!" The lieutenant obeyed. He was in such a state of mind that if Kuso had told him to die, he would probably have obeyed, as a result of terror and suggestion. "Do you want to howl like a dog too?" Kuso said to West. "Really, the possibility does not concern me," the craggy man answered. "Did you have that in mind for me?" The tone was conversational. "West, this is no time to go over," Zen growled. "I have no such intention, Colonel." "You admitted once that what you wanted most to do was to join the Bronze Youth. I'm asking you—" "Shut up!" Kuso screamed. "The next person to open his mouth without my permission, I will have shot out of hand." "Ah," West said. The Asian leader started to shout an order at his soldiers to shoot the craggy man, then changed his mind as he realized that even though he had the weapons and the men, there was nothing he could gain by killing the goose that might possibly lay a golden egg. As much as he wanted to have West killed for defying him, he knew he would have to save this pleasure until later. Kuso swallowed his anger. Since his rage was so great, he had to swallow several times before he got it all down, after which he looked as if he were going to choke on it. "Look, let's be reasonable," he urged. "I'm willing," Zen said. "You're not worth a damn to me," Kuso shouted. "He is worth something to me," West interposed. Again the Asian swallowed. If ever he reached the explosion point, his anger was going to come out as boiling rage. "As I said, let us be reasonable and talk this over together." "Glad to," West agreed. "What is more reasonable than a corpse?" The question took Kuso aback, but only for an instant. "Come to think of it, you're right. Nothing that I have ever seen is more agreeable than a corpse, to me that is. Are you still determined to volunteer for that position? Or should I say, condition?" "Any time," West answered. "As I told Kurt some time ago, I am rather tired of this plane of existence, and I would like to see what it's like over yonder. Not that I don't already know," he added. "You know what it's like beyond death?" Kuso asked, curious in spite of himself. "Certainly," West said, in a sure tone of voice. Listening, Zen again had the impression that the craggy man was stalling for time again. On the other hand, he might be telling the literal truth. He might know what waited at the end of life. If so, Zen let this possibility slide hastily out of his mind. He had more to think about now than he had brain cells to use for the task. "Then, what is it like?" Kuso asked. "You have heard of heaven?" "Yes." "That's where I'm going." As he spoke, West vanished. A stunned silence held the big gallery. Kuso, his mouth hanging open, stood leaning forward. On the floor, the lieutenant dared to sit up. He even dared to speak. "See, that's the way they went. I couldn't stop them." Kuso shouted an order at his men. Zen found himself tied hand and foot. A raging maniac paced the floor beside him. Every now and then, Kuso kicked him. Screaming at the top of his voice, the Asian leader invited Zen to vanish too. It did Zen no good to try to protest that he was not one of the new people, that he knew nothing of the method they had used in disappearing. In Kuso's mind, he was one of them. He was to be treated as such. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Doomsday Eve by Robert Moore Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doomsday Eve, Chapter 13. At first, the lighted matches under his toenails hurt like the very devil. He had never known such pain. Then he forgot about the matches under his toenails. They started lighting them under his fingers. "Where did they go?" Kuso screamed. "How did they do it?" Zen had long since ceased trying to say that he didn't know. Instead of speaking, he shook his head. This was all he could do. Kuso interpreted the headshake as a stubborn refusal to answer. He kicked the colonel in the face. At the kick, the race mind clicked in. This was the effect Zen had, as if a third person had suddenly come in on a party line. After that, the pain from the kick did not seem so important. The torture from the matches under his nails seemed to diminish also. Not that the contact with the race mind nullified the pain or made it any less real. Fire was still fire, and torture was still the same, but neither were very important. Other things were. Zen tried to concentrate his attention on the other things. The room, the shouting Kuso, the two Asians who were holding him down while the third thrust the matches under his nails, the shivering Cal, the lieutenant who was overeager to obey his leader's orders. All these seemed to become misty and vague. These things were real. There was no question about that. But his mind was contacting another reality which made these things different. Time began to lose its meaning. He wondered if he was fainting. Another question came across his thoughts, heeled over like a sailing ship moving across the wind. Was he dying? There was no shock with the thought. If that was the way it was, then he was more than ready. "You are not fainting, and you are not dying," the race mind whispered to him. "Come closer to me." "How do I come closer to you?" "Let go." The voice of the race mind was like a whisper from the other side of infinity. "Let go and come to me." Dimly, he wondered how one let go. The answer came with the question. The words meant exactly what they said. The meaning was literal. Let go. As he performed the action that went with the words, the big gallery, Kuso, the lieutenant, and the torturers faded away and became a part of a misty world that seemed to have no real existence. Even the pain vanished. "Come to me," the race mind whispered again and again, a luring voice that drew him irresistibly. Abruptly, he was back in the gallery. He did not know how long he had been gone, but he realized that some time must have passed, enough to allow them to set up a portable radio transmitter in the gallery. The set looked to be very powerful. A yellow-skinned operator was huddling over the controls. In contact with Asian headquarters, Zen thought. He knew his thinking was correct. Off somewhere in the distance outside the mountain, the night shuddered. He knew the meaning of the sound. A rocket ship was either landing or blasting off, probably the latter. A long line of burdened Asians was moving through the gallery. At the sight of their loads, Zen knew what had gone into the hold of that ship. The equipment of the hidden center here. He saw parts of the super radar go past on the backs of sweating Asian soldiers, and he knew where this was going. At this knowledge, anguish came up in him. With West super radar in their possession, no American secret was safe from prying Asian eyes, unless some way could be found to shield the frequencies employed. Such shielding might work for laboratories, but there was no way to shield troop movements and takeoffs and landings. These would be as public as an advertisement. His face was wet. He could not understand this until another bucket of water hit him. An Asian bent over him, saw that his eyes were open, and grunted with satisfaction. They started again on his fingers. The radio operator called to Kuso, giving him a message. Zen could not understand the language, but the Asian leader was both startled and elated. He shouted at the men carrying loads to work faster. "Not much time left. Big bomb coming." What bomb? Zen thought. With the question came the answer. Warned by Kuso that their preparations were probably known, the Asians had decided to launch their super bomb immediately. Turmoil came up inside Zen at this knowledge. Real pain came from his fingertips as the torturers began operations again. "Do you want to die?" the race mind whispered in his thoughts. Although he couldn't contact it, the race field could reach him. "You have suffered all that is required. You have met the law. You may join me if you wish." Zen shut off his thinking. This was fantasy, the product of torture and nearing dissolution. His own imagination was tricking him, he thought. "This is not your imagination," the answer came. "This is what you call the race mind." "But how do you know? You don't. At this point, you have to accept me on faith." The thinking flowing smoothly into his mind went into silence, then came again, stronger than before. "Do you want to die? You have earned the right." "No," Zen answered. He screamed the words again. "No, no!" "The path before you will be difficult." "I don't care how difficult it is. There's work to be done." Again he shouted the words. "Very well, it is your choice. You may remain among the living for as long as your strength may last." The voice whispering in his mind went into silence. Kurt continued screaming. Pain raced through his consciousness again. As he came awake, he realized that he was screaming at the torturer to stop. He also realized that the Asian had stopped. There was a sound in the gallery. Filling the air, it seemed to emerge from the very walls of the mountain itself. The note of a violin. High and sweet and compelling, the sound came from nowhere. Every atom in the solid stone walls seemed to pick it up and to rebroadcast it. The molecules of the air seemed to dance in resonance with it. Simultaneously, about 10 feet above the floor, the face appeared again. The lieutenant's rifle blasted at it. He fired shot after shot at point-blank range. Red-hot slugs howled from the walls of the big gallery in a cacophony of death. The face smiled at the lieutenant. The lips moved. "Keep shooting, old fellow," the lips seemed to say. The officer emptied his gun. In a desperate burst of fear, he threw it at the mocking face. The weapon passed through the face without harming it. "You fool! That's a projection, not a real person!" Kuso shouted. He grabbed the officer by the shoulder and spun him backward to the floor. "Who are you?" he demanded of the face. It smiled at him. Zen repressed the impulse to shout. He knew what was going to happen next. "I said, who are you?" Kuso shouted again. The crash of something in the gallery jerked his attention away. Twisting his head around, he saw that one of the soldiers engaged in carrying the loot of this cavern out to the plane waiting to hurry it to Asia had collapsed on the floor. Under ordinary circumstances, Kuso would have had the man summarily executed. But with that face smiling at him out of nothing, these circumstances were not ordinary. Zen, knowing what was going to happen, forgot the pain of his burned fingers and toes. He could feel it creeping over him in waves. This time he did not resist it. He let his eyes close. When he opened them, the torturer was snoring beside him. Every Asian in the big gallery was sound asleep. People were crowding around him. The new people. In a sweeping glance, he recognized every person he had met here, except Nedra, and he did not see her at first, because she was busy bandaging his hands. West was smiling down at him with an expression that was somehow grandfatherly, but back of West's smile was a perturbation. Zen started to get to his feet and discovered they had not as yet removed the ropes from his legs. As one did this, Nedra clucked reprovingly at him and tried to tell him that he was wounded. He said this did not matter. Faces were here that he did not recognize. This did not matter either. "You did this?" he said to West. "Yes. I designed and built the equipment. Others were operating it in this instance." West had something else on his mind. "Thanks," Zen said. "Why didn't you take me with you when you went, wherever it was you went?" "We couldn't," West answered. "You haven't had the training." "Why did you come back?" "To rescue you." "Kurt." West had something that he wanted to say. "Nedra, will you stop fussing with me? I'm all right." "But your poor hands and feet." "I don't even feel them. I won't have them to feel at all unless action is taken. Don't you understand? Somewhere in Asia they're getting ready to launch a super bomb. Or maybe it's already on its way." "I didn't know," the girl said. "The big one?" "Yes." A flicker of pain crossed her face, and she shook her head. "I always wondered what it would be like to live on a mud flat. I wonder if we will be oysters or eels, or maybe crabs." "What the hell are you talking about?" Zen demanded. "After the bomb goes off," the girl said. "What then?" "The race mind will have to start over again," she explained. Her manner indicated that she was explaining something that she clearly understood. She seemed to wonder why he did not understand it. "Maybe we will be turtles. That will be funny. A turtle that can remember when it was a man. That's the way it will be. Except... I know all about that. Except that the turtle won't be able to do anything about its memories," the girl continued, as if she had not heard him. "It will have flippers and a beak, but what it will need will be hands. It won't have them until it grows them itself. A turtle with the memories that it was once a man, knowing that if it had hands, it could rebuild human culture." A bemused expression appeared on her face. "I wonder how the race mind will solve that problem." Again she seemed to muse. It would be worse to be crabs. Or would it? "Shut up," Zen snarled. "We're not turtles yet, or crabs, and we're not going back on the mudflats." "But we're on the edge of them," the girl insisted. "One more teeter and we will go totter." Zen turned to West. "What the hell has happened to Nedra?" "Nothing," the craggy man answered. "She has some degree of clairvoyance, and it is coming to consciousness. Unfortunately, she has not yet had the time to develop her talents in that direction." "Maybe the turtle wouldn't want to rebuild human culture," the girl interrupted. "Maybe it wouldn't want to go back down that blind alley again. Perhaps it would decide to go into another channel, to develop into something totally different. In that case, it might not need hands." Zen deliberately ignored her. He turned to West. "A bomb will be going off," he said. "That is what I've been trying to talk to you about," the craggy man answered. "This is another reason why we came back for you, so we could talk to you about that bomb." "To me?" Zen said, startled. "Yes, to you. Why?" "Because you are Colonel of Intelligence and have experience in such matters. Also because you are something that none of us are, a fighting man." I don't understand you," Zen answered. "I can get you there, but once there, my knowledge fails. I, to my regret, know nothing of fighting." West spread his hands in a helpless gesture. "Get me where?" Zen asked. "To Asia. To the underground cavern where they are getting ready to launch that bomb. West explained. The tone of his voice said this was easy. The hard part came in knowing what to do and being able to do it after they were there. To Asia? Zen parroted the words. He had the dazed impression that this whole scene was unreal, that the snoring Asians on the floor, Cal huddled by the wall, and the new people crowding into the room would shortly all vanish in puffs of green smoke. How in the hell will you get us to Asia? How did we get out of this gallery? West responded. How did we vanish? How did the men in the reports you read get into the planes that were about to crash? Who landed Colonel Grant's space satellite? Who steered it? Who provided the power to energize the motion? Who... Did you know I knew about Grant? It was obvious that you must know. And you can get me to Asia. You and as many others as you choose to take with you. Walking over to the sleeping lieutenant, he picked up the man's rifle, then turned to the group. Who will go with me to Asia? He asked. The group stepped forward as one man. A knot formed in Kurt Zen's throat at the sight, and he gulped to force it down. He knew how much this decision meant to them. They had been trained in the ways of peace. They were searching for the road to the future. Fighting meant turning backward on the path that led to growth. It was the last thing they wanted to do. Yet do it they would, if it was necessary. In an instant, they were scrambling for weapons from the sleeping Asians. Then they were trying to salute and tell him their names and say they would follow him at the same time. One man saluted well. "Red Dog Jimmy Thurman," he said. Pride was in the man's voice. Zen caught the man's arm. "Red Dog Jimmy Thurman? But I know you." "Maybe you do, sir." Thurman spoke with the soft drawl of the Old South. "One of the new people appeared in your plane and saved your life," Zen burst out. "Yes, sir. That's right, sir." "But you deserted." "Put it another way, sir. Let's say I joined the right side." "How did you find this place?" "I just kept thinking and kept trying. Eventually, we found each other. The psychos tried to make me believe I was nuts. But I knew better. I knew what had happened, and I knew there had to be a reason for it. I kept hunting until I found that reason. The big part of the battle, where I had an advantage over most everybody else, was that I knew from experience that something was going on. Knowing this much, all I had to do was keep looking." The man's voice drawled the explanation. His eyes smiled. "At your service, sir." "Do you know that going with me may mean death?" "What's death, sir?" Red Dog Jimmy Thurman grinned. "I died over the North Pole, sir." "Spike Larson," another man said. "You were in a sub," Zen challenged. A glow was coming up inside of him like nothing he had ever experienced before. He was getting fighting men to stand beside him. "Yes," Larson answered, "and I will consider it a privilege to stand beside you." Like soldiers, they passed in review before him, the fat boy, the tall, lean, brown-skinned youths. Somehow, he thought there ought to be another one. He looked around for him. Grant was talking to West. Grant was the man whose face had looked out of thin air in the middle of the room. Seeing that Zen was staring at him, he left off his talk with the craggy man and came over and saluted. "How was it up in that satellite?" Zen asked. "Lonely as hell, Colonel," Grant answered. "Do you want to go with me to Asia?" "There's no place on Earth I'd rather go. And, the way things stand now, I don't have much choice. If they get that bomb into the air—" He left the sentence unfinished. Then Nedra was standing in front of Zen. At the sight of her, it seemed to him that the world stood still. He shook his head. "Why?" she challenged. "Because I love you," he answered. "Then that is the real reason why you should take me with you," she answered. "I don't follow," he said. "If you fail, there will be no tomorrow," she answered. To her, the statement had no answer. "Besides, I am a nurse," she continued. "If there are wounded, I can help with them." "But—" "The fact that you love me does not enter into the situation. It is a thing apart. It is a very wonderful thing," she added hastily, the starlight shining in her eyes. "And I wish we could bring it to fruit the ways it used to be. But those days are gone. And I am going to Asia with you." Watching, West smiled. Zen spread his hands in a gesture of defeat. He turned to the craggy man. "This sleep thing. I don't know how you do it, and don't much care, but you obviously have a portable generator of some kind that you use to put the lieutenant out in the ghost town." "Yes," West agreed. "I'd like to borrow the unit," Zen said. "Gladly, Colonel. I wish we had other weapons." "We'll make do with what we have," Zen answered. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Doomsday Eve by Robert Moore Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doomsday Eve, Chapter 14. 0-1 hour, the loudspeaker droned in a Chinese dialect. In a deep cavern in the hinterlands of Asia, men responded to the command coming over the speaker system. Already driven to the point of exhaustion, they were working harder than they had ever worked before. The moment of victory, for which all true Asians had lived, was near at hand. The launching of this bomb would make the Asian Union master of the world. Orders had come through to launch this bomb immediately. 0-45 minutes, the speaker said. The drone had gone from the voice of the officer watching the time. A rising excitement appeared in the tones, as if he too had caught the scent of fear rising in the vast underground depot. So much was left to be done. The atomic warhead was already in place, waiting for the day of launching. Otherwise, the task would have been impossible. The driving engines were complete, but had to be fueled. The steering equipment was almost ready. Only the installation of the left gyroscope was necessary. This was at hand, waiting to be installed. 5 technicians constantly got in each other's way as they tried to slip the delicate instrument into place. 0-30 minutes. The gyroscope was eased into place and tested. It was found to be in perfect working order. In the course plotting room, the final calculations were being made. Wind direction and velocity aloft had been noted across half the planet. This had some importance on the launching and landing end, but had no significance when the bomb itself was out of the atmosphere. The target had been figured and refigured. Actually, the target was anywhere on the continent of North America. If this bomb struck anywhere in the Mississippi Valley, the whole watershed below the striking point would be scoured clean of all life. Water carrying radiation downstream would account for that. 0-15 minutes. On the outside of the mountain, in a special observatory constructed for this precise purpose, radar scopes for tracking the rocket were ready. Instruments in the laboratory there were for the purpose of changing the course of the superbomb if it veered too far from its destination. The technicians there were on their toes. They had no guards to encourage them, but they needed none. They knew what would happen if this bomb failed to land and the fault was traced to their door. What would happen when the bomb landed? Hell would happen. Probably the crust of the earth would open up in a hole miles in depth. Meteor Crater in Arizona would be the work of a child compared to the result of this explosion. What had happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be nothing in comparison. The possibility existed that the molten magma of the core of the planet would gush forth. No one knew for sure whether or not this would happen. If it did take place, the result might be the sudden appearance of a lake of overflowing lava. The shock waves from the bomb would probably be strong enough to pull down every skyscraper that still remained standing in America. The effect on the watershed where the bomb landed will be almost complete catastrophe. If it struck on any of the rivers or streams flowing into the Mississippi, the water supply of all cities downstream to New Orleans would be contaminated. Nobody knew what the effect of the fallout from this bomb would be. High air currents might carry radioactive particles for thousands of miles from the explosion point, where they would fall as a gentle but very deadly rain upon the earth below.
0 minus 10 minutes.
The high, thin note of a violin appeared in the vast underground cavern. Amid the scurrying of feet, the shouts of the foreman bossing the work gangs, and the occasional cracking of the rifles of the guard, the sound was unheard by the ears. But deeper centers heard it. The first man to go was a fat engineer. Sighing, he stumbled and fell. When he did not rise, a guard approached him. As the guard determined that the man was snoring, he lifted his rifle. The engineer died without awakening. Another shot rang out as another man went to sleep, then continued on to join his fathers. The technician busy filling the fuel tanks of the rocket was the third man to go. He managed to finish closing the filler cap and to lay down his flexible line before the urge to sleep overcame him. By this time, the guards knew that something was wrong. Silence came over the cavern. In the stillness, the note of the violin flickering up and down the scale could be heard. Men looked at each other in growing apprehension. Looking, some of them lay down and went to sleep.
"Sleep gas," an officer bawled.
"Shoot all foreigners on sight." The officer suspected that some spy had slipped into the underground cavern and had released gas there. His command was intended to enable his men to find and eliminate this alien. As such, from a military standpoint, it was a good command. It had this deficiency. When his men did not find any aliens, but their own people continued going to sleep on them, they began imagining foreigners. The guards began to shoot their own technicians and engineers. As panic swept through the cavern, guards began to shoot other guards. Soon, the people in this huge underground chamber were tearing and destroying each other. And one other thing. They were also going to sleep. The panic grew to hurricane proportions. When Kurt Zen appeared inside the cavern, the whole vast place was as still as a tomb. Smoke from the rifles hung in the air. The cavern stank of death and fear, but the bomb still rested in its launching cradle. Zen took one long look at that bomb. He felt his sigh of relief clear down to the ends of his toes. At the sight, the last remnant of pain vanished from his toes and fingers. Not that the damage done by the matches did not still exist. It did. But in the surge of elation that swept through him, he completely forgot the pain.
"We just got here in time,"
a man said, appearing beside him. It was Spike Larson who had spoken. Awe on his face, Larson glanced around the cavern.
"They started killing each other. They must have gone nuts."
"I don't blame them," Zen said. "I damn near did on the way here." "That trip through nothing is sure a stinker, isn't it?" Larson answered, grinning and shaking his head. Zen agreed with him wholeheartedly. After tuning his body to an instrument in the cavern, hidden so well that Kuso's men had not had time to find it, West had punched a button. The machine had vanished. West had vanished. A horrible moment had come when it had seemed that his feet were standing on nothing more substantial than air. What he had felt under his feet had, in fact, been far less substantial than air, which had body. It had been even less solid than space. It had been nothing. Swishing, Colonel Grant came into existence on the other side of Zen. Grant looked fussed, but he gripped the rifle he had taken from one of Kuso's men with determination.
"Just between you and me, I'd rather fly a space satellite to Mars any day in preference to facing this jump."
"I know what you mean," Zen said. As he spoke, another figure came into existence to his left. Nedra. She came spinning into reality with a smile on her face. Zen wasted a moment wondering what kind of cast-iron nerves this girl had.
"It looks as if all we had to do was to tie them up," Spike Larson said. "This is almost too good to be true."
"It is too good to be true," Zen said. Turmoil was somewhere. He did not know where, but it seemed to him that a vast uneasiness had suddenly come into existence. It had to do somehow with the future, with a something that was about to happen.
"Halt!" Grant's voice rang out.
Zen swung his gaze around just in time to see an Asian lift himself to his feet near a control board that stood beside the rocket. "He's walking in his sleep," Larson exclaimed. 0 minus 1 minute, the loudspeaker announced. "Where in the hell is that man on the speaker?" Grant demanded. "The sleep frequency didn't get to him." "No time to be concerned about him now," Zen said. The turmoil that existed somewhere had increased in intensity. Somehow it was concerned with the solitary Asian who was reeling in circles like a drunken man trying to make up his mind. "Shall I shoot him, Colonel?" Grant demanded. Zen hesitated. He knew that West's deepest wish was to avoid violence if that was possible. The split second's delay was fatal. Grant's shot rang out, much too late. Reeling on his feet, the man reached the control panel and pulled the single switch there. A heavy thud came from the rocket as a ram drove home inside the heavy metal hull. "Get back!" Zen screamed. He caught Nedra and pulled her backward. Beside him, he knew that Grant and Larson were also reeling backward. Inside the rocket, a steady rumble of sound was building up. Low in frequency, but heavy in volume, it seemed to shake the foundations of the Earth itself. Inside the vessel, heavy heat charges were building up. Smoke and flame spurted backward as the first warming charge let go. For all Zen knew, this section was to have been cleared before the firing of the first rocket. He did not know whether provision had been made for the elimination of flame and smoke, but he knew that heat and smoke hit him as he pulled Nedra away. Then the main charges let go. Rising like some devil spurting upward from the depths of hell itself, the launching cradle carrying the rocket lurched upward. The stone floor shook underfoot. The mountain shook. Unless this rocket could be stopped, the whole planet would shake. Earth would twitch her skin like an elephant stung by a giant wasp. With a thundering roar, the rocket shook itself loose from its cradle and hurled into the sky under its own power. "West!" Zen shouted. "Yes, Kurt?" The craggy man's reply was as prompt as it would have been if he had stayed in the same room. Actually, he was in the American Center. "We've lost," Zen said. "I know," West replied. A sadness as deep as the ocean of space was in his voice. "Pull these people back to you." "Of course. Me last." The last lingering roars of sound were still pounding down the bore of the launching cradle. "Why do you want to be last?" "Duty," Zen said. "Get that miracle device of yours into operation pronto." "Sure, I'm starting now." "Hey, guys, you're going home," Zen yelled at the people with him. "What good is it to go home?" Spike Larson asked. "There won't be any home within an hour," Grant added. "Or however long that rocket will take to land. Why go back to what isn't there?" "That's where we will start the task of rebuilding," Zen said. "Rebuild what with what?" Larson demanded. "There will be something left," Zen said firmly. "You are already underground. You will stay that way. Keep the good fight going for years. Raise some kids to keep it going after you are gone." He felt very firm and sure about what he was saying. "You're full of hot air," Red Dog Jimmy Thurman said. "Besides, you are planning something else," Nedra spoke. "You want to get rid of us so you can—" "West!" Zen shouted. "Yes, Kurt. Take him away!" Zen yelled. "They're trying to rebel on me. Take Nedra first before she reads my mind." "I'm working as fast as I can," West answered. "This instrument has to be tuned to the individual body frequency. "I knew there was something," Nedra began, and vanished. Zen grinned. He had the impression that she was calling him names that no lady should speak as she went away. Time would cure that, if any time was left. In the chamber, an Asian was stirring. "Zen, old man, what are you up to?" Grant asked. "Take this one next," Kurt ordered. Grant looked reluctant but resigned as he disappeared. Zen was alone in the big chamber. Smoke swirled from the ceiling. One Asian was already on his feet and a guard was sitting up. "I've got them all here." West's voice came across vast distances. "Good. Are you ready?" "Yeah," Zen answered. but I'm going that way." He pointed toward the ceiling. "Kurt!" West's voice was sharp with sudden pain as he caught the colonel's meaning. "That way or no way," Zen answered. "But that's not a passenger rocket." "The hull will hold enough air to keep me alive for as long as I need to be there." "But the rocket is in constantly accelerating flight. It's a moving target." "Red Dog Jimmy Thurman's plane was falling, and Colonel Grant's satellite was moving, and Spike Larson's sub was on the bottom of the Indian Ocean. Don't give me any backtalk, Sam. Somebody got into that plane, and that satellite, and that submarine. I can get into that rocket. You're the man who can put me there." "But I'm not on that target." West's voice had a wail in it. "Then get on it." Kurt Zen sounded like an exceedingly gruff drill sergeant addressing a new recruit, or like a colonel who had his mind made up. "All right, I'll do my best. But something will remain here, Kurt, even after the explosion. We'll be safe, in a way, here." "That argument has already been used by me to get the others back to you. You and I know, Sam, that hell won't hold a hat to the American continent if that whizzer hits." "All right," West repeated. I'm on the rocket as a target." "Good." Zen repressed every muscular tremor everywhere in his body. Somewhere there was jubilation, a sensed but not tangible vibration that he could not locate. He concentrated on the jubilation. A layer of smoke floated down from the ceiling, like a descending death pall. The guard had gotten to his feet. He had picked up his rifle and was staring around the room, seeking either an explanation for what had happened or a target. To him, which he got didn't matter. His eyes came to focus on the lean colonel with the bandaged fingers. That uniform did not belong here. The guard raised his rifle. "Good luck, Kurt," West's voice whispered across the space between two continents. As the gun exploded in his face, Kurt Zen felt his body vibrate into what seemed to be nothing. Again, the terror wrenched at his soul. Again, he experienced the mind-compelling agony of this incredible type of spaceflight. This time, he did not mind these terrors. Somewhere in his mind was jubilation. Wondering if it was the forerunner of death, he continued to concentrate on that. Dimly, as if from some other space or some other time, he was aware of a roar. The rocket swam into existence 10 feet away from him. He was outside it, in airless space. West had made a miscalculation. Agony seared every cell in his body. Pain clamped at his throat like hands trying to choke him to death. "Oops, I made a mistake," he heard West gasp. He was moving with the rocket on a parallel course. West had matched course and velocity, but he had not achieved his exact aiming point. Error in the instrument? Human mistake? Who knew? Who cared? Click. Like a vast ocean of warm, pulsing, sure power, the race mind came into Kurt Zen. It existed here in space, too. He had never thought of that. In what little thinking he had had time to do, he had considered it as a super special sort of field which possessed intelligence, but which was limited to the surface of the planet. Here in space, it sustained life in him. He did not know how this was done. This was one of the mysteries which must be left to the future to solve, if there was a future other than the mudflats. It felt to him as if a vast tidal current was flowing into his body. Click. He was in the rocket. The smell of overheated oil fouled his nose. As he tried to move, he bumped his head. He was in a narrow passage. Ahead was a control panel with automatic devices. He began to crawl in that direction. Noise was a thundering roar in his ears. His whole body felt as if it was about to shake to pieces. The passage was narrow. It had never been intended for humans. Moving upward, Zen found it was too narrow. He got stuck. No matter how hard he tried, he could not move an inch forward. The control panel was so close he could spit on it, but it could not have been farther out of his reach if it had been on the other side of the moon. Air was getting short. He twisted and squirmed, fighting like the devil, but his body was wedged into the narrow passage in such a way that he could not move. Something pulled at his arms. Nedra was directly ahead of him. She was trying to pull him forward along the passage. "You?" he whispered. "Who has a better right than I?" she answered. Sweat grimed her face. Her hair was awry. Fiercely, she pulled at him. The rocket yawed, beginning its turn in space. He forced himself forward, and came free. Somehow, he found the strength to pull himself up in front of the control panel. He was running on nervous energy now, and he knew it. No strength was left in his body beyond what he was forcing into it. "Send it out into space," he muttered. "Send it out there." He tried to wave his arm in an outward gesture and bumped his hand on the steel hull. Light came through a circular port. He had a glimpse of the Earth down below. The planet was very far away. Blue seas and green land. The planet was also very beautiful. He fumbled his way over the controls, trying to understand them. Somewhere, stabilizing gyroscopes were running smoothly. He could hear them. The controls were simple. He decided which way was up and jammed home the controls. Nothing happened. In the confined quarters, his laughter had madness in it. Nedra stared at him. "What happened?" "Nothing. Nothing happened. They're locked in place." His eyes grew very wide. "These controls are only for establishing the flight course. Once that is established and the rocket launched, they automatically lock in place." "Then we can't change its course?" "No." Her face puckered, and she looked like a small girl about to cry. Another panel to the left caught his attention. It had a red button on it. He studied the wiring on it. "By thunder!" The words burst involuntarily from his lips. "What is it, Kurt?" "They put a manual control on the warhead. It's got to be that. It can't be anything else." He pointed to the red button. "Why do you suppose they did that?" "Test purposes, probably, to check the firing mechanism before the warhead was installed. What difference does it make?" Nedra's voice was listless. "Maybe we can go to heaven." "What do you mean?" He explained very carefully what he meant. "Explode the rocket here in space?" "Sure," he said. His tone of voice said this was nothing, that anybody could do it. West's voice clamored in his mind again. He ignored it. His hand moved toward the red button. "There's one thing I want you to know," he said, pausing. "What is that?" "I love you," he said. She came into his arms like a tired, frightened child. "I knew that the minute I saw you," she said. He held her close to him, and she lay there, seemingly very content. "All right," she said. "I'm ready." Her lips sought his. Kissing her, he reached behind her back and punched the red button. A relay thudded. Darkness closed in. Kurt Zen came out of that darkness to find himself staring upward into the face of Sam West. There was something about that face that was familiar, something that he should have guessed long before. He tried to think what it was. "How'd you get to heaven?" he said. "The warhead had a delay relay on it," West explained. "It was about 30 seconds, as near as I can figure it. Anyhow, it gave us just enough time to snatch both of you out of that rocket before she blew." What he said sounded very important. Under other circumstances, Zen knew he would have considered it important, but other things seemed more significant now. "Did she blow?" he asked. "All of 10 minutes ago," West said exultantly. "Do you know what this means, Kurt? Do you know what it means?" "Yeah," Zen answered. "I won't have to be an eel." There was still this other thing that was important. "Say, an eel?" For an instant, the craggy man was puzzled. Then he grasped the meaning. "You're right, Kurt. No eels for any of us." "That's good," Zen said. Nedra. She's right here beside you, still out from exhaustion. But she will be all right." "Good," Zen said again. This other fact was still in his mind. As he tried to think what it was, the answer came to him. He looked up at the craggy man. "You're not Sam West," he said. "No," the craggy man said, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "Then who am I?" "You're Jal Jonner. Nobody but Jal Jonner could have done all the things you have done." "You're right, Kurt. I'm Jal Jonner. And you're Kurt Zen. And this is Nedra." Zen saw the smile on the face of the craggy man. It was a very good smile, the best he had ever seen. Then it faded away as he sank into the deep slumber of exhaustion. He did not even feel Jonner place Nedra's hand in his as he went to sleep. The End of Doomsday Eve by Robert Moore Williams.